the relatively unexpected and huge victory of Volodymyr Zelensky in the April second round of the Ukrainian presidential elections has been mirrored by a also huge election victory in Ukraine's pre-term parliamentary elections in July. The Zelensky's group, Servant of the People, from both proportional votes and from first-past-the-post majoritarian seats, looks to be having something like over 250 seats out of about 423. There's about 27 which are not in the Ukrainian parliament because they're under Russian occupation. There should be 450. The nearest group to Servant of the People, to give you an example of the huge gap, is the opposition platform, and they have about 44. So 44 to 250, that's a huge mandate and huge majority. And good for Ukraine that this is throughout the country. This isn't like in the old days where one part of the country won over the other. And hence that shows that a lot of the things that Zelensky's been talking about, for example, fighting corruption, actually unite the country. And a lot of the doomsayers who used to say that Ukraine was always, on the verge of catastrophe, collapse, disintegration, are proven to be wrong, because there's obviously far more that unites the country than does not. But 5 or so important, I think, observations at this early stage, and obviously this is a very fluid situation. Firstly, I think this can be certainly defined by political scientists and experts as the end of Ukraine's post-Soviet era. I think it's an important watershed from that point of view. If everything prior to this was in many ways the post-Soviet Ukraine, including the generation that came to power in business and politics in the 1990s, the Poroshenkos, the Yulia Tymoshenkos, Viktor Yanukovych's, etc., even Yushchenko's. This vote, both in the presidential and parliamentary election, was a vote against all of them. It was a vote not just against Poroshenko, it was a vote against that generation, that establishment, and that post-Soviet era. I think political scientists would also probably rightfully say that the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Euromaidan in 2013-2014 were stepping stones in this direction. At the time, many people thought they were the end of the post-Soviet era, but we saw that they weren't. They were just part of the battle, as it were. They were the tactics. The strategic victory is in some ways this year. And I think what also helped to culminate this was the collapse of the pro-Russian camp party regions of the communists in 2014. That removed a huge block in Ukraine's further progress, and also enabled this move towards this ending this post-Soviet era. So I would regard 2019 as the watershed of the end of Ukraine's post-Soviet era. Zelensky did not make money in a sort of corrupt way in the 1990s, as many of the people who were rejected did, and he's not in any ways tied to that era. So he doesn't have, as it were, skeletons in his closet from that era. There's no compromat on him from that era. And therefore I think it is true to say that this is a watershed. Plus the kind of people he's brought on board, him and Sviatoslav Vasyl in the new Holos party, these are also of a similar like mind, people who do not have that, those skeletons in their closets, do not have those links to that period. So I think Vasyl as well as Zelensky are a product of that, of this watershed, this post-Soviet era. Secondly, as I've mentioned, as it were, I think it's important that this shouldn't be seen just as an anti-Poroshenko attack. This is a rejection of the entire establishment. The establishment which ran Ukraine in kind of using musical chairs throughout the last 25 or so more years. So it's not just Poroshenko, it's Gritsenko, who yet again never failed to get into the Ukrainian parliament. He must be the biggest failure in politics anywhere in the world, I think. Tymoshenko, Sadovey, and of course even pro-Russian political forces. So all of those were in some ways linked to that post-Soviet transition period. Obviously, many of them had their links to corruption and to unpleasant aspects of that, unfulfilled dreams. And so I think this anti-establishment wave, if you want to call it populism, is a rejection of all of those. And hence that reinforces the first point, that this is a crucial watershed separating the post-Soviet to the non-Soviet era. Thirdly, we saw and this is where it becomes a bit complicated, we saw the defeat of many of the Euromaidan liberals, Mr. Najem, Mr. Leshchenko, and others. They call themselves the Euro-optimists in parliament. Many of them in 2014 were elected in the Poroshenko bloc, but very quickly became dissidents in the Poroshenko bloc, and sort of 5 years of criticism of Poroshenko. They never got their act together. They had 5 years with which they could have united different, disparate liberal forces. For example, there's something called Democratic Alliance, which has been around for a long time. They could have united these forces, could have created a new liberal force. They had 5 years to do it, but instead I think they focused on their own self-PR. And that I think narcissism on their part was a major mistake, and they never really put any investment into creating this, shall we say, a new liberal force that could have participated in this year's presidential and parliamentary elections. And hence they were not taken in by Zelensky's party, Vakarchuk's, or of course Poroshenko's and Tymoshenko's. So if the Euromaidan liberals were defeated, they were not re-elected, what does that make Zelensky? This is where it becomes very difficult to pinpoint what kind of ideological niche he has. Or is he something for everybody? Is he a kind of a Macron, the president of France? I mean, you know, kind of a centrist who appeals to a broad range of people. Possibly, but that also has the dangers of being quite populist as well. And, you know, you can't please everybody. So inevitably somebody is going to be displeased very quickly. Fourthly, and this is of course important and good and reinforces previous points, the pro-Russian camp was not successful. The pro-Russian camp is anyway extremely weak compared to prior to 2014. There is no more Party of Regions political machine, and that was a very big political machine. In the parliament prior to 2014, the Party of Regions and Communists controlled half of parliament. Now, and they controlled the whole of Russian-speaking eastern and southern Ukraine. Since then, you've had the opposition bloc. The opposition bloc itself was very weak in relation. It only had about 40 seats. And even that split into two in November of last year. So we have the Akhmetov, the Donetsk clan-led opposition bloc, and we have the gas lobby in bed with Viktor Medvedchuk, Vladimir Putin's man in Ukraine, leading the opposition platform. Of the two, only opposition platform really got any votes, but even they only got 43 seats, which is not that different from the 39 that they had in the current parliament, the outgoing parliament. So not exactly a major boost for them, 39 to 43. So I don't think that they're going to be much of a threat or anything. And there's no way that Zelensky is going to go into government or into coalition with these pro-Russian people. Now, does that mean that revenge by the former establishment is not likely? Well, I don't think that the opposition bloc, the former Party of Regions, can itself undertake revenge. But the major failure of Poroshenko's presidency was by far the best of all Ukraine's presidencies in terms of accomplishments. Ukrainian journalists, experts, including myself, would give him anything between 6 and 7 out of 10. That's extremely good for Ukrainian politicians. It's actually good for Western politicians, to be quite honest. But his major failure, and the failure of that establishment, that post-Soviet establishment that was rejected, is that they never understood the concept of sprawiedliwość, justice. They never understood why this was a central concern of Ukrainian voters. They never could put people in jail. It's one of the peculiarities of Ukraine and post-Soviet politics in general that the elites seem to be unwilling to put other members of the elites in jail. Presidents can go to jail in Brazil, Peru, Armenia, Pakistan, Egypt, and many other places in the world, but not Ukraine. Why is that? It's very difficult to understand, and it's certainly a product of the president controlling two institutions that are simply, I think, beholden to corruption and should be either closed down or certainly reformed. Closed down in the case of the General Prosecutor's Office. I think it's a bordello. There's no other way to describe. It's a mafioso bordello. It's the biggest corrupt institution in Ukraine, and it's controlled by presidents, creates it into a place not where the rule of law is implemented, but where somebody who's accused comes to buy his way out of it. So it's a market, it's a whorehouse for selling off corrupt cases. And the security service, it basically does what the president wanted to do on these kinds of issues. So I think this major failure on the part of Poroshenko to also, like in the case of Yushchenko, to not put bandits in jail, the terminology of the Orange Revolution, has potentially led to revenge, because a lot of the very unpleasant characters who were hiding under rocks for 5 years have now reappeared in Ukraine, have come back from exile in Moscow or elsewhere, and they are trying to turn the clock back. And when the Poroshenko camp talks about the threat of revenge, it's quite ironic, because the president had the potential in those 5 years he was in power to prevent that revenge taking place. Why is Viktor Medvedchuk still even in Ukraine? Why is he elected to parliament? He's President Putin's man in Ukraine. There's simply no debate about that. Why is he allowed, as a threat to Ukrainian national security, to control 3 to 4 Ukrainian television channels, including one of the most popular, Interchannel? And the list could go on amongst the other individuals who were never put in jail, never prosecuted, and who have now reappeared in Ukrainian political life. Thankfully, Ukraine's judicial system, Constitutional Court, Supreme Court, Central Election Commission, were strong enough to prevent many of these from standing in Ukraine's elections. But Medvedchuk is now in the Ukrainian parliament, for example. Others were not so lucky, like Andrei Kluyev. But that whole field is the area that Ukrainian voters, that Poroshenko, like previous presidents, failed on, and an area that Ukrainian voters want Zelensky to be successful on. And this is where I think, so on my fifth point, final point, the two major concerns of Ukrainian voters are the war in the east and corruption. Zelensky's actually talked about Ukraine fighting two wars, against corruption and Russia. As I've said before, I don't believe that that much can be done on the question of the war with Russia. They can be playing around at the margins, the release of prisoners, for example, maybe a ceasefire. But there will not be a major success in the area of bringing peace to the Donbass, and forget about Russian de-occupation, Russian withdrawal from the Crimea. So the idea that Zelensky could be successful in that field of bringing peace to eastern Ukraine is, I think, not likely. I would certainly think that he can't do much there except on the margins. But, and that means that Zelensky's major focus is going to be the war against corruption, the war against the Sistema, as it's called, the war against the establishment, changing the way Ukrainian business, Ukrainian politics, Ukrainian government is undertaken. He has no excuses now. He can't blame the lack of influence in parliament, the lack of influence in government, lack of support in society or the West. He now has a massive majority in parliament. He doesn't have a constitutional majority, which is important. That means he can't turn the clock back on certain things if he wanted to. But he has a massive government majority, which means he will control the parliamentary coalition, either on its own or in coalition with Vakarchuk-Holos, and he will also control the government. That means there won't be the friction between the president and parliament and government as we had after the Orange Revolution, which is important. There wasn't that friction as well under Poroshenko, which is also key. But if you now have a massive parliamentary majority, control of the government, and you have an anti-corruption court in place and beginning to function from this summer, and the court was created with the support of Western governments and Ukrainian civil society, and deliberately geared towards putting elites on trial who could not go on trial in the corrupt judicial system, then if Zelensky fails, it's because he has not provided political will. If he succeeds, good for him. He will become Ukraine's George Washington. But he has no excuses, and Ukrainians will want heads on spikes. They want results quickly. They are very impatient. They feel they've waited too long already. He needs to show results in this field, i.e. high-level trials, high-level convictions, within 6 months to a year. If he does not, his popularity will plummet, and particularly his members of parliament who were elected in first-past-the-post majoritarian seats will slowly begin to defect from him. So his coalition will start to decline in number. So he needs to show that that he can do something concrete with the huge majority he has and with the institutions that are in place that were created under Poroshenko, by the way, the various anti-corruption institutions. These were all created under Poroshenko, but Poroshenko never got to the stage where these institutions were used to put corrupt senior officials in jail. So to cap it up, Zelensky now has a historic opportunity as Ukraine's, as it were, first non-Soviet Ukrainian president with the post-Soviet era over, with a huge parliamentary majority. He will try to, I'm sure, bring peace to eastern Ukraine. I think he'll fail, but let him try. But his major area of work will be continuing the European integration path that was begun under Poroshenko and implementing those areas that were never undertaken under Poroshenko, which is putting senior officials in jail and making sure that senior elites are accountable under the law. Now, once senior Ukrainians, officials and politicians and businessmen, oligarchs, become accountable under the law, this will be itself a new watershed for the country, because accountability for elites never existed in Tsarist Russia, never existed in the Soviet Union, and never existed in that period of time of post-Soviet Ukraine either. So this would be, again, something new. So President Zelensky, it's all on you. You have nobody else you can blame if something goes wrong. You have all the levers at your disposal. Many of them were created by your predecessor, so don't go too hard on Poroshenko. And you have the support of Ukrainian society throughout the country. If you fail, it's on your head. If you succeed, good for you. Thank you.